The Falklands, a group of bleak, windswept islands that at one time few people had heard of and fewer still could place on a map. But this anonymity was forever shattered in 1982, when Britain went to war with Argentina over the ownership of this tiny territory. Lying in the South Atlantic Ocean, some 500 kilometers off the coast of Argentina and almost 13,000 kilometers from the UK, it seemed inconceivable that these two nations would unleash their full military might in a battle for control of this little patch of land. One prominent Argentinian writer described the Falklands conflict as two bald men fighting over a comb. But the war was anything but pointless to the men who fought in it.
My comrades and I, we always say that there was a turning point in our lives, and the Malvinas was that turning point.
I think this is the reality for all veterans. We live and die with the Malvinas in our hearts. It will never leave us.
Las Malvinas is Argentina's name for the Falkland Islands, controlled by the British since 1833 and home to 3,000 of its citizens. In Argentina, the term Falklands is never used. Malvinas, on the other hand, has an almost sacred resonance. Every town has its Malvinas monument, as much a reminder of whom they believe the islands belong to as a memorial to the fallen. The Malvinas have never left the public consciousness, and sovereignty remains an article of faith for every Argentinian president, left or right. But politicians only have to stir the embers of nationalism. A quarter of a century after the war, the islands remain an obsession.
The Malvinas are not European. They are in Argentinian waters. They belong to Latin America and are part of our territory. I think that it is about standing up for our dignity, for our nation's sovereignty, over something that belongs to us.
In 1982, Argentina was in crisis. Civil and political unrest had led to a military coup 6 years earlier. The military government, known as the junta, had initially attacked its left-wing opponents, but the purges had spread, and as many as 30,000 were tortured and disappeared as part of what became known as La Guerra Sucia, the Dirty War. Isolated both domestically and internationally, the junta's leader, General Leopold Galtieri, had promised to hold elections. He believed that by delivering the Malvinas to the people, he would cast himself as the savior of Argentina and ensure an election victory on a wave of euphoric nationalism.
I think
Galtieri was simply up against the wall, with the Plaza de Mayo full of people telling his government to leave. The political situation had gotten out of control, so they invented a war against the British, thinking that the British would never fight.
On the 2nd of April 1982, a massive Argentinian force captured the Malvinas, overwhelming the small garrison of British Marines. Overnight, the mood of the protesters in the Plaza de Mayo turned to joy. But not everyone was celebrating. Alejandro Rey had finished his national service and just found a job. He was at work when he heard the news.
I felt ill. I said, this is madness. They're going to send us all. And a workmate said, no way, don't worry, they won't send us. We're from La Plata, it's too far away. We aren't properly trained, the weather's different. They'll take the regiments from the south.
The country's cold southern tip was home to its best trained and equipped troops. But Argentina was in a dispute with neighboring Chile over another group of islands and did not intend to leave this border undefended. Galtieri chose instead to send the conscripts of the 3rd and 10th Brigades from North and Central Argentina to occupy the islands. Untrained, ill-equipped, and totally unprepared for the South Atlantic, with winter approaching. Miguel Garcia was from Corrientes, a hot, dusty town in Argentina's impoverished north.
Corrientes, Chaco, all from the north. We all went to the Malvinas. We've never understood why. The Marines stayed on the mainland, and so did the units from the south, who were used to the cold conditions.
People from Corrientes and us? It was totally incredible. When we arrived in the Malvinas and we saw the people they had sent, we thought that this couldn't possibly be a real war.
But they were soon to find out that the war was all too real. Even so, and despite their apprehension, many of the young conscripts initially felt a sense of pride at being the ones chosen to occupy the islands.
We were excited. There was a feeling that we wanted to defend the motherland at all costs. We felt proud to be going to the Malvinas.
I arrived at night. It was raining, it was cold, it was shaky on the plane. And when I got off, I was very emotional. And that night, I felt as if I was somewhere a lot of Argentinians would have wanted to be.
For others, it was an alien experience. The Malvinas had been British for 150 years, and the Falkland Islanders did not consider the arrival of the troops a liberation.
When I stepped on the soil of the islands, I felt like a foreigner, because the people who lived there were totally different to me and to my comrades. The terrain, the houses, everything was totally different. One boy approached us, and when I went to caress his head, his mother came running out to grab hold of him because she was scared I would do something.
At this stage, though, it seemed inconceivable to the soldiers that their presence on the islands would lead to military confrontation.
We thought that the English weren't going to come to the islands because of what our generals had told us. They said it was impossible, that it was too far away. We were simple soldiers. We believed in what they said.
However, Britain was also experiencing civil unrest, prompted by record unemployment levels. The British government, led by Margaret Thatcher, was hugely unpopular and already in danger of losing power in the next election. Just as for Galtieri in Argentina, retaking the islands became a matter of political survival, and a military task force was dispatched within days. Neither side could afford to back down, and all attempts at mediation failed as the British fleet made its way relentlessly south. On the 1st of May, the warships arrived off the coast of the islands, and the air and naval bombardments began.
We were listening to Radio Argentina, and we realized then that we were being lied to. They were still saying that the British would never come, but we could hear the shells falling.
The British task force rapidly exerted a stranglehold on the islands and began to soften up the Argentine positions in preparation for the arrival of the slower troopships at the now inevitable landings. Conditions for the conscripts rapidly deteriorated, and supplies of even basic foodstuffs began to dwindle.
The cold became normal, but the wind was always painful. We needed sugar to try and calm us and give us warmth, but there was no food left, only the continuous bombing throughout the night from the British.
The generals had expected a direct attack on Port Stanley and had concentrated their forces around the capital, leaving other potential landing sites sparsely defended. Miguel Garcia's unit was sent to guard San Carlos on the west coast.
We took our positions in San Carlos on the night of the 20th, and the next morning they started bombing us.
Unknown to Miguel and his comrades, this was the beginning of the British landing, and their small unit was facing the vanguard of the British Army.
They landed at San Carlos on May 21st at dawn, and we were in hand-to-hand combat with the enemy. We were beaten in the battle. I got a bullet in my leg, which is still there, in my femur. All this happened at 5 a.m., and when our unit could hold out no longer, we surrendered and were taken prisoner.
Although less than half the number of the Argentinian garrison of 12,000, The British advance set well-armed professional soldiers against cold and hungry conscripts, who were only now learning the harsh realities of war.
At the beginning, it was a sentiment of pride. It was poetic to say we would give our lives for our country. But as the war went on, we knew that we were fighting for our own lives.
The British also advanced at night, making use of their superior training and equipment. In a series of battles, they took the hills above Stanley. Guillermo's unit was guarding the approaches to the capital.
From nightfall until sunrise, there was a constant bombardment from the English fleet and from their planes during the day. And I'm talking about attacks that fell not 5 kilometers away. No, shells that were landing 50 meters away, 30, 20. I felt panic, a lot of panic. I didn't know what a shock wave was. It was like an invisible hand that crushes anything that it is near. I saw comrades die because they got caught up in the shock waves. One of them, my friend Vallejos, he had only been in the army a month.
On the 12th of June, Norberto was caught in another artillery barrage.
2 bombs hit me, and I realized that I had lost my left arm because I could see it hanging off, and part of my femur was sticking into my stomach. I tried to put myself back together. I pushed my intestines back into my stomach with the belt I had, trying to bandage my arm, but I was swimming in blood, so it wasn't easy to know what was going on. And my comrade thought that there was no way I could survive, so he shot me in the chest.
As the British closed in, Galtieri ordered his troops to advance on the enemy. But even as he made his speech from the safety of the mainland, some of his officers were already deserting.
When they had to face a real enemy, they ran off like rats. There were very few officers, I could count them on one hand, who actually had balls and who really fought. Only a few who were truly proud of the army they were part of.
What was left of the army was soon following the deserting officers in a headlong retreat to Port Stanley.
When I looked backwards, I saw what was left of the regiment. Men destroyed by war, a pathetic sight, which I will never forget. At that moment I sat down, dismantled the rifle, and left it on the ground and said, "This war is finished for me."
We felt great relief, but sadness too, because we knew that we had failed. Most people don't like losing. In my case, I don't like losing, and I knew we had lost.
Despite their inexperience and the miserable conditions they'd survived for so many weeks, many of the young conscripts fought bravely against a better trained, better equipped, and above all, better led army. Perhaps the hardest thing for them was the way they'd been used by the men who'd sent them to war.
They never even dirtied their boots on the battlefield, Galtieri and the generals. They directed the war from safely behind a desk on the mainland, so we all felt betrayed.
The military were not the only ones to turn their backs on the defeated conscripts. 12,700 Argentinians had surrendered to a force of only 5,000 British, and some saw this as a humiliation.
Society didn't want to know. It turned its back on us. In 24 hours, everyone had forgotten that we had fought a war, apart from the veterans.
The war had ended, but for many of the young conscripts, their ordeal was far from over. The war cost 258 British and 649 Argentinian lives and left the Union Jack flying once again over Port Stanley. The British were eager to remove the defeated conscripts, and together with the wounded, they were transferred to the British troop ship Canberra for transport back to the mainland. To the surprise of many, they found themselves better treated by the enemy than they had been by their own officers.
I would like to underline the humanity of my experience when I was taken prisoner, the kind way in which I was treated. People from England wrote to me when they saw my photo in their newspapers, and they said how sorry they were for me and my family.
I remember that we traveled home on the Canberra, which the Argentinian military said they had sunk. It was a ghost ship for us. It had never been sunk. It was just another one of their lies.
The same military met them at the docks.
We thought we were going home, but instead they took us to a military base so that they could try and brainwash us.
Just as before the war, the regime's concern was not for their young conscripts, but for their own political survival. They seemed to believe that by silencing the returning men, they could erase the memory of defeat.
When we were in the barracks, they made us sign an agreement so that we wouldn't speak. So with society silencing us, and the silence we already had in our hearts, it was very disheartening.
After 3 days at the base, we were taken by bus to our hometowns. We were brought in at night by the back door and told again never to talk about the war.
Despite their treatment by the government, some still believed that they would be welcomed back as heroes after what they'd suffered.
I imagined that they would stop the traffic on my street and give me a hero's welcome, with a big party and a sign saying, "Welcome Edgardo, our war hero." And as I approached the street, I swear I thought that this was what was going to happen. I needed it. But when I turned the corner, there was a barking dog, a light, and my mother, no one else.
I think the aftermath was more important than the war itself. That was the hardest part. At war, we were all the same. After the war, we were isolated. Society itself marginalized us.
Argentina was in turmoil. None of the problems that had led to the invasion had been solved. 18 months later, the junta relinquished power, and elections were held for the first time in 10 years. The nation celebrated, but it made little difference to the veterans.
When the democratic government came, they still hid us away. Malvinas was a censored word. We weren't even allowed to speak about it. It was probably a defense mechanism, a sense of shame, like a family who has a drug addict child and tries to hide the child away so their reputation will not be stained.
Jobs were scarce, but veterans faced an extra hurdle.
The veterans were always regarded with suspicion. When I first went to the town hall and tried to get work as an ex-serviceman, they rejected me. They considered that I was dangerous. So I changed my ID card so it didn't say anything about my military experience, and I told them that I had lost my arm in a motorbike accident, and then I got the job.
Rejected by the government and ignored by society, many could not cope.
I suffered a serious breakdown 4 years after returning, and I was in psychiatric treatment for 2 years, medicated, with acute depression.
For some, the support of their families saved them, but for others, the trauma of the war and their rejection by the country they'd fought for was too much to bear.
Argentina didn't have the same problems as in the US, where Vietnam veterans would climb to the top of buildings and shoot people. Argentine society was lucky. Veterans were ashamed of admitting that they had fought in the Malvinas, because our society had rejected them in so many ways, so they killed themselves silently.
Eduardo Paz was a gunner defending the approaches to Stanley. When he arrived on the islands with the Argentinian invasion fleet on the 2nd of April, he sent a postcard home to his mother Margarita, signing off with the same words he always used. "Don't worry, I'm fine." But a very different son returned from the Malvinas.
When he came back after the war, he was really quiet and he said nothing. He was distracted, and at night he had terrible dreams. He would sit up in bed as if he were lost. I would hold him and tell him he was safe at home with his mom, and he would go back to sleep. He was in that state for a long time.
On November the 22nd, 1999, Eduardo climbed to the top of the monument to the flag on the edge of the Parana River, the symbol of Argentinian nationhood.
He went to the monument, and then he jumped off. He didn't leave a letter. He left absolutely nothing. He tried to do it so that no one would realize that he was going to kill himself. There was no clue that he didn't want to live anymore. I think he chose the monument to make a statement to all. To the public for their indifference, to the authorities because they didn't do anything. He did it for his comrades.
Less than 250 Argentinian soldiers lost their lives on the islands. Perhaps as many as 400 have killed themselves since. The numbers of the dead are hard to extract from the lives ended by alcoholism, drug addiction, and poverty.
I think they created the centers for veterans because of this, because we needed to be with each other. We are the only ones who understand each other.
Each week all over Argentina, they meet to remember a war that took place more than a quarter of a century ago. Photos of those who died hang on the walls. Young men frozen in time, but many of the living are also trapped by the past.
There are ghosts in all soldiers, and we all have that sense of death, that deep vision of death that comes from having been at war.
When the war was over, the British offered to repatriate the bodies of the Argentinian dead, but the government refused. It knew that by leaving them on the islands, it would ensure that there was at least a corner of the Malvinas that would remain forever Argentina. Guillermo returned to the islands last year, a pilgrimage that many have made to visit their fallen comrades.
One of the great debts that I have had pending with myself was to return to the cemetery and bid farewell to my comrade, Vallejos, to say goodbye to him because I wasn't able to say goodbye to him when he died in combat. I went into the cemetery and something happened that broke me. In fact, that my friend's tomb was not identified. There were many that were identified with first and second names, but the tomb of my friend, no. I laid the flowers down on the tomb that said, "To the unknown soldiers, known only by God." It's very difficult to explain. It's a strange feeling, but also a feeling of relief, of peace more than anything. I did what I had come to do.
For others, the journey has no end. Norberto returned to the islands last year, bringing back earth and sand which he bottles and sends to comrades who've been unable to make the trip. Edgardo has written a book, Enlightened by Fire, which tells the story of their war and has now been made into a film.
The point is how to manage your ghosts. I always say the ghosts are present. I am not cured, but I try to live with them at a distance, but without them hurting me. I try and live with them, and I think I have managed to do that.
In 2004, the government substantially increased the modest pension paid to the veterans, the first step in recognizing their suffering. But just as in 1982, there are elements in Argentinian society that believe the veterans have exaggerated their suffering and should move on.
Even today, people say we went on a picnic and now have 2 pensions. I'd like to see them survive 74 days at 20 degrees below zero under constant enemy fire.
The Malvinas Memorial lies at the heart of the capital, a constant reminder of defeat and loss. Every day, with the going down of the sun, the dead are remembered. For those who survived, it's hard to accept that the last chapter in the island's history has been written.
After everything we lived through, and those who died, those who were ignored, those who killed themselves, we still have this dream that one day the islands will be ours again.